we dive into some of the content, let me go ahead and give a quick introduction to our gracious panelists who are joining us today. So first of all, Garrett Yoshimi. Garrett serves as the Vice President of Information Technology and the CIO of the University of Hawaii System. So Garrett is responsible for the University of Hawaii system-wide information technology systems and services. Garrett provides executive leadership in the overall visions, goals, strategies, and plans for the effective use of information technologies at, again, University of Hawaii systems. And he also sits on our board of directors, the Quality Build Design Advisory Board. Amy, welcome to the call. Thanks for joining us. Amy is the Director of Sponsored Programs and Research for the Southern Connecticut State University. Amy has worked in research administration since 1997 with operational experience in both pre-award, post-award, and research compliance. Amy, you did your first cloud implementation with quality research at Towson University, in 2014, and recently implemented quality research in 2018 and protocols in 2019. And quality build recently, I think, in 2020, so you've just been back to back with implementations. And then finally, we have Brian. Thanks for joining us on the call. Brian is the Executive Director of Enterprise Architecture and Infrastructure at UC San Diego, University of California, San Diego. Brian has a long-standing career history, over 30 years, specializing in information technology, with over 16 years in IT leadership in higher education specifically. So Brian, you're currently responsible for the university's core network, computing, and integration infrastructure, as well as enterprise architecture practice overall at UC San Diego, supporting bringing new technologies and innovation into the organization. And Brian also sits on our Quality Build Design Advisory Board. So again, thank you all for being here. The goal of what we're trying to get out of today's webinar is we've heard consistently over the course of the last month how challenging the current pandemic experience has been. Having, from an IT perspective, to quickly shift to online learning and support, not only do that, but support thousands of remote workers simultaneously. In addition to, and what our focus of today's webinar is, figuring out how do you take all these in-person processes you once did in person and quickly move them to a remote location. That's a very difficult thing to do just like that. In a way, we're seeing a force of digital transformation that we've never seen happen so quickly on campuses. And that's both exciting and daunting. So today our three panelists are living this daily in their roles and figuring out how do you triage, how do you support the transition of moving once in-person processes remote, and hopefully for the ideal, once those processes have been moved remote, maintain some of that once life does return a little bit back to normal. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and jump in. We've got a few questions that we prepared in advance, but like I said, if you have questions throughout about your own experience, feel free to ask them in the Q&A box and we'll try to get to them throughout today's discussion. So the first question that I'm really curious about is, we've heard from a lot of our customers and our foundation members that you're likely receiving so many requests from all over the campus in order to automate processes. So I'm curious to know, what are you finding to be the most critical requests you're receiving from departments in terms of how do you automate processes, or from within your department that you're currently supporting? Whoever would like to take it.
So I'll jump in with a couple things to start. So we've been trying to automate processes forever now. So that's literally our job on a day-to-day basis. And the current crisis has lit a fire under it for many folks. In our traditional in-person environments, there is the ability to default to the paper process just because. And with the majority of our folks, our campuses are still open, but the majority of our folks are working from home. All of a sudden, you don't have the ability to go grab the paper anymore. Campus mail continues to flow, but if you're not there when the mail shows up, the physical mail shows up, it doesn't work anymore. So a lot of our requests are around automating things that, or trying to automate workflows that typically or continue to happen in paper. And then a lot of crisis-based additional requests in terms of, how do you process leave paperwork, or how do you process change of status paperwork in a very timely manner, just simply doesn't work in the paper world anymore. We had financial and personnel folks having to show up to campus to sign papers and move them along that in the old world was okay, but in our current world simply doesn't work. So a bunch of those requests, and never waste a good crisis, a bunch of those requests can pretty easily be done with online systems that we had many of them ready to go, but a lot of the ad hoc requests are simply difficult to fill with some of our legacy tools. So Build actually um, has a very critical role for us in being able to respond quickly to some of these requests that are coming out. We literally just stood up a online administrative leave request yesterday because that process was essentially thrust upon us, and then we had to figure out how to do it, how to do it in very short order.
I'll jump in next. So Southern Connecticut State University is a fairly small institution, and my office manages a very small pre and post award world for small by comparison to the University of Hawaii and of course UC San Diego. And what was happening for us as the COVID-19 emergency evolved is the emergence on our campus of multiple automated tools for internal routing, internal approvals, or automated signatures. Our backup system, now that COVID has shut down our campuses, the backup system is email with a PDF or copy of the form and approval in the email trail, which is being saved to a PDF for audit files if necessary. But we have multiple tools, with Koali Build being one of them, that are allowing us to take priority forms and processes and move them into an electronic signature. So fully legal documents with vendors or sub-awards, those kinds of things, we can certainly send through DocuSign or what I call the sledgehammer of approvals. It comes with 6 pages of legal language, but we are more quickly using Koali Build to adapt to what are internal approvals only. They are forms or documents or pieces of information that transport from the individual investigator or department level to an internal department before they transform into a purchase order, or before they transform into a payment voucher for a vendor. So those kinds of internal pieces, that's pretty much how we're distinguishing which tool we're going to use and which process we're going to approach first. Does it involve an external vendor or an external entity, so therefore the legal language is more important? Or is it strictly an internal process that we can remove from our email trails and provide that audit documentation of approval and information quickly and easily? So it helps to have Koali Build as that sort of quick pocket tool that we can either use for full form redesign and creation, or we can simply use for transport. The form itself in the paper format is okay, but we can attach it to a Koali Build shell and move it along to the correct internal department. Right now, our biggest process is from my department, because since I'm not IT, we don't cover the full campus for this support. Right now, I'm working with the Faculty Development Office, the Faculty Research and Advisory Committee, as well as the Provost Office and some limited HR forms. And basically, we're churning out a new form or a new item almost every week to 10 days.
I guess I'll jump in now. So specifically with regard to the COVID situation, kind of a combination of things happened. Some of the departments on campus that normally would require wet signatures on things had to quickly move into some other automated tool to do so. And so we've made heavy use of DocuSign for most of those situations, similar to what others are doing. But also there were finally, you know, I know from the IT front, others push, and I've been pushing hard on why do we need wet signatures on lots of these documents, and keep getting told, well, it's a policy. Of course, the policy you can never find. But that was getting questioned seriously by our senior leaders, like our CFO and the vice chancellors on campus. So a lot of that just got squelched or got then routed through a DocuSign or some other tool. Now for us, we had just, as Katie knows, completed a workshop on campus the second week of March to start using Build and start to expand the use of it throughout the campus. And we had some of our campus partners from our computer science and engineering group, and then also within the central IT organization participate in that. So we do have some prototype other workflows that are set up within Quality Build. But part of our aim with all this is, so we're in a rather interesting situation in that we are in the middle of a large scale ERP rip and replace while this happened. So we are a month away from bringing up a new payroll system. And we are 2 months away from bringing up a new finance system. And so this is all happening while we're all working remotely. Luckily on the IT side, we've been used to working remote, so it wasn't a big lift, but from a lot of our campus partners that are participating in the implementation, it's a little more difficult, or has been. Well, things are settling now. But one of our primary focuses for the use of Build going forward is part of this ERP rip and replace is to incentivize the campus departments to start shifting a lot of their local, we could call them kind of lighter weight workflows that normally they would hire developers to build tools, and we will run all those through Quality Build. So we have a fairly aggressive roadmap that we're looking for this. We'll see how we do getting through these big things in the next couple of months.
Interesting. I thought what was interesting, Brian, about what you said, and I think Amy, you alluded to it a little bit as well, was the need that you're not just changing a process. In some ways, you have to question the policy behind the process, because in order to actually change the process, you have to question why it was done that way in the first place. Do you all have any recommendations about how, in this current situation, you're trying to go through the change management of policy change while you're remote? I mean, I feel like that would probably be a difficult thing to do. But I also think in order to automate processes, that's a really critical thing in order to question that first. So any feedback on what that might look like?
At Southern Connecticut, the big change seems to be, or the big sort of marker, if you will, in terms of policy change, is whether it's something that actually has to go up through our Board of Regents, or whether it's something that we can handle local to our campus. So as a state school, we have 16 other sister campuses, community colleges, and 3 other universities that are all part of that Board of Regents support. So when we're talking about a large policy change, the use of DocuSign for legal signatures, for example, that directive is coming down from our Board of Regents, and they've been supportive. And certainly as we interact with other state agencies, since much of our funding in the sponsor portfolio comes in and out from other state agencies, that software of choice for the legal documentation between different entities is very important. So Quality Build becomes, that marker is it an internal or an external entity? And what kind of information are we recording? It really helps to sort of keep an auditor's perspective on it. Is the email trail provides us with an audit perspective, right? It documents the approval in written form, but at the same time, it's not necessarily accessible to the administrators who might need to access that audit information, or it creates an additional burden for the administrator to print to a PDF or reserve in a way that would be made accessible to an auditor. So if I were to ask myself one or two primary questions about whether a process or a policy needs to change, the first question is it more global and therefore must go up to the Board of Regents, or is it something that I could work with more locally just to my campus and my provost? My provost and my vice president of finance are very supportive of what we're doing. In fact, I had conversations with both of them yesterday where they're just very pleased at the transition and the support, particularly that we can provide through Quali Build at this point. It's a matter of teasing out how that global policy statement really works out. And as long as it's internal to our campus, then the more refined questions of what's the real purpose? Are we creating auditable documentation that will be easily accessible? Those are the things that become more critical.
Thank you.
So one of the pretty interesting elements around policy is we actually pushed an executive policy. So our layers are Regents policy, executive policy, administrative procedure. We actually pushed an executive policy about 2 or 3 years ago that actually said for internal university routings that a wet signature is explicitly not required. And as long as we can use something that ties back to our common authentication system, that's absolutely equal to, and in many cases, and in fact preferred to, a signature on a piece of paper. The fascinating thing is that we actually pushed the policy out. I actually think we pushed it out in 2017, but there were still pockets of financial administrators, personal officers that were insisting internally in their own little cocoon that no, in my world you have to use a wet signature, so everybody underneath had no choice. The crisis does a couple of things. It actually helps us to push a pretty heavy hammer down on folks that are now questioning their own decisions to require a wet signature. And we have policy cover. We absolutely have policy cover for internal transactions. External is a little more difficult because other parties are involved, but internal is pretty simple for us now. And Build actually gives us a way, because it's tied to our single sign-on, to enforce that pretty quickly with a tool that you can deploy quickly. Because the other side of that is, okay, you're telling me you can use your authentication, but if you don't give me a tool that can do it quickly and effectively, I'm still going to force my people to use paper and pen. But we now we've got a couple of tools actually that allow us to push it out quickly. Build is the more agile of the tools in our belt. So it gives us a way to do it very quickly and do it in a timely manner, especially when we have to respond to these kind of needs.
I'd second Garrett's comments in that, a lot of cases you got to kind of first determine whether it's actually a policy or just a practice that people have adopted, and then they pretend it's a policy or keep calling it a policy, which of course we've never encountered that before. But we have been fairly successful, even years and years ago, of getting certain level of approvals just done throughout systems where you can log a specific user that they acknowledged something, especially with regard to timekeeping systems and things like that. Because previously, I know that there were hard copy signatures required on timesheets even before that would be officially approved. So there's a lot of that, which is why this situation that we are in now tends to break down a lot of those fake policies, you could call it, and/or practices that were just there because some people don't like to change. And so this is an opportunity to start to insert some of the technology in places where it will actually do what as intended, which is to provide additional value and efficiencies throughout the organization. So that is one thing that this event we're all going through is kind of opening up for the IT function throughout higher ed, and definitely throughout, I'm sure, other organizations, is being able to, you get a hammer or whatever. It's us being able to slide in and say, hey, you know what? Here, we can make this happen. This is how we do this. This is what we're here for. And so Build is a good tool in our toolbox, because it's one of a few offerings we have to be able to slot things in as they meet certain requirements for us.
Do you all have any concerns then, and whoever wants to jump in on this, about, change management is hard. I think, again, maintaining that change is harder. So are you all thinking already about what happens after this? And we're able to use this opportunity in the current state of, let's maintain this, let's change these processes or policies, let's enforce it. But what strategies are you thinking about, and we're all worried about what the fall is going to look like. I think summer, the experts say we'll probably see a reduction, but we might see a spike again in the fall. So what are you thinking about in the next few months about how to maintain some of these changes you're making now?
The maintenance is that's actually a good question, because I know there are some departments and components of our institution which have less than modern viewpoints about how work gets done and how the use of technology and tools can actually enable that group to be very efficient. Now, one thing we do have, at least in where I'm at, is support from the chancellor, CFO, and the vice chancellors. And I'm sure other organizations are going through this once in a lifetime opportunity where IT is actually finally seen as the hero, saving the organization and being able to make this shift. And so we've been able to use some of that. Some of it has to be somewhat top down, just because of the way that different organizations are structured. But also, you've got to, in certain cases, sort of strike while the iron's hot and get in and try to establish some of these efficiencies kind of early on. It makes the argument to fall back on bad practices harder to do. So anyway, that's some of the stuff we're thinking about, and in certain cases actually doing.
So at Southern, we are just beginning to do strategic planning in the next 2 weeks around what does fall look like. The entire administrative campus is breaking up into subcommittees that will look at different aspects of this: operations, academics, research. And so the way we're dealing with this question is, what do we do long term, is the whole community is going to participate in these discussions over the next 2 weeks to form a recommendation about what to do if and when the campus reopens later in the summer, or if fall is a hybrid situation. And frankly, the longer the work from home or remote situation goes on, the easier it will be to adapt these remote support strategies and keep them in place. Because once we begin to open up, the economic realities of 2021 or 2022, even as the immediate crisis recedes, the economic challenges that are left behind are going to force these efficiencies, or not only will they be required, but they'll be greatly appreciated if all we can do is maintain what we have at this point in time. Because the economic disaster of what's happening on our campuses without people attending physically, that is changing the whole higher ed market in a way that I can't predict. I can only see that there'll be a lot of big changes, and any efficiencies that we can introduce now, and the longer they get to stay in place during the current sort of temporary emergency process, the more they'll be appreciated when we transition back to what we thought was normal life. And on that score, as far as I'm concerned with Southern, that's sort of the silver lining to it. You know, we were in a position 3 years ago where everything was completely paper-based, and we needed to make that electronic transition administratively, not only in our research portfolio, but also in our business operations. And while we were coming along with that, the COVID-19 emergency has sped up that process, but it was one that was necessary for our campus to begin with. And I believe that when we come back to normal face-to-face interactions, because we will appreciate leaving the paper behind, those policies and those things that are going on, and the transitions that we can make now, I think they'll take hold, and I think we'll hang on to them.
Yeah, you know, so the current crisis is in our face, but for all of us in higher ed, we were already facing a crisis in terms of sustainability. What is the long-term view of the institution? How do we compete? You know, if you roll the clock back, last year's question was how do we effectively compete with the all online competitors that are entering our market now. So this really raises the stakes to another level in terms of how do we compete to stay alive. And I think, you know, this is Amy and Brian were talking about the spring, the summer, and then the fall, and then the spring following are we're gonna continue to face a bunch of challenges around how do we do this in a world that never returns to the normal of last year, the normal. So everybody will fondly talk about the good old days of thousands and thousands of people on campus, and the prospects are those are going to change dramatically. We would absolutely like to see our students return in fall. We are planning for that, but at the same time, it's not going to be the same as last fall. It absolutely will not be. And nor will any of our work processes and the way that we do business. And this is our opportunity to put some of those changes in place. We've done it in a crisis/panic mode for the past several weeks, but as we go into the summer and then into the fall, we're going to have to figure out how to do this on a more permanent basis. Work at home is probably going to be, or work remote is probably going to be some part of that for an extended and maybe forever period of time. I also think that in many of our cases, and we're starting to hear back from not just our IT folks, but also faculty and staff across the system that, you know, there has to be something in between, because the pure work completely remote is absolutely, at least in my mind, is absolutely not as effective, and we're not as efficient as we need to be. We can handle the situation because we can do it, but from a collaboration and a creativity and a how do you create the next university environment, it has to be something in between. So we're trying to, so the pendulum swung literally all the way to the everybody's away side, and we're going to be someplace in between. We're not going to be, I think we're going to have a hard time ever getting back to the everybody's in one place scenario, but the work remote thing is, I think, going to be continue to be a pretty significant part of our lives.
I want to get back to, in a bit, automation and the processes that you're focusing on, and even a little bit more about some of the tools that you're using. But we did get a question that I think is pretty relevant to bring up now from one of our attendees about this concept of working remotely or hybrid remote, which we might see at some institutions in the fall. And the question is, do you think some level of remote work would ultimately benefit higher education long-term? And are there things that you're doing either within your teams or that you've heard about in your institutions? I'm curious about this, of starting to plan, well, maybe we should move half of our team remote long-term outside of the context of the pandemic. Anything you want to add on to that?
So that's actually been part of our practice in the past, but it's not been front and center. So IT folks in general, I think most people would agree, have done this over a long period of time, but it's always in pockets. It always is in specific areas because of the nature of the work in those areas. So I think this brings it more to the front, and I think it creates an opportunity for us to leverage our ability to do this in our environment and frankly make our institutions more attractive as a place to work for both existing as well as prospective employees. I think it is part of the mix, and I think it will continue to be, I mean, in particular in IT, it will continue to be part of our portfolios. I don't see it going away at all.
Yeah, I would second that, and we've had a very strong telecommute, remote work, whatever you want to call it, program in place. We actually moved out of our building for a year, few years ago, for them to renovate the whole thing, and we moved back into complete open office, no offices for anyone, including the CIO. But along with that, we had, and I have roughly 170, 180 people under me in one form or another. And I had probably a third of those telecommuting 100%, some few days a week, some others. So the remote work piece, I think in terms of the remote or hybrid model, is probably going to be a little bit more of a challenge and question to the non-IT groups that weren't working remote, or they had a policy that you couldn't work remote. And that's just a thinking pattern that needs to change in terms of believing that remote work is less productive or less efficient, which is actually not true. And one thing it does do is it sort of begs the question, not necessarily about remote versus on-site work. And for me, I think a hybrid model is likely one that works best. But what it does is, what is the way the organization works in the first place? And so what a lot of groups have done, including us, so what happened when we lifted the entire IT group and everyone started working remote, we essentially replicated the way we worked at the office in a remote fashion. So there were still countless, I would call them unnecessary meetings that get scheduled. And so you got to ask the question, for me, it's more of a blend of synchronous versus asynchronous work. And how can you get an organization to get more available, efficient hours out of the team in total through a better blend of which I would call between synchronous and asynchronous work. So you get really focused effort, especially for tech folks and folks that are having to use a lot of focused time to get things done. And so it's what I'm more concerned about or more interested in finding out is, can we start changing those practices such that when we return back to a hybrid model or in the office, we've actually shifted the way the organization works and are a much more efficient team in total as a result of it.
So that's a really interesting question, Brian. And just listening to you is triggering all of these ideas and thoughts where I'm going, oh, I need to talk to my administration. Because outside of the IT world, within the traditional higher ed model, the administration organization is all around the basic business processes. How do we hire people? How do we get people paid? How do we pay vendors? How do I get my reimbursement for something I bought and I have to submit the receipt for? And the question of whether that work has to happen in the physical world or can work in a hybrid or asynchronous model, where some of the when we're talking about space issues and those kinds of things, where we could actually address those space issues in a very different way if the strategy and approach to working remotely was considered more appropriately for non-IT folks. My institution, the atmosphere has basically been, nope, if you're not in IT, you need to be on campus, because everything we do is in a face-to-face model. But there are times when that face-to-face model creates a spark of imagination or a spark of innovation that just can't happen in the asynchronous or just strictly in the electronic communication. And then there are those of us who are extroverts who just like being around people now and then. I mean, I love having my morning coffee, but I like sharing it with other people physically in that space, you know. So I believe that the hybrid model can work, and I can think it can work definitely outside of just the IT area. Faculty, of course, are on a hybrid model all the time because some of them teach online or they have hybrid courses. But for that administrative component, those of us who are strictly working in the business offices, being able to find that balance is a real challenge. But I've got ideas after listening to the conversation here, so thank you.
Sounds like that's really interesting. It sounds like one hybrid might seem to make a lot of sense long term. And I love the conversation about how can we use this opportunity, whether it's policy or processes or reducing ineffective meetings. How can we use this to force some of those changes that we've been wanting to change for a long time? I think I want to take it a little bit back and go back to some of what you talked about a little earlier around your tool set. So I've heard two tools named, which I think are helpful, and most of the individuals have likely heard of them, which is Quali Build, Forms and Automation Tool, and then DocuSign, which it sounds like you're using more for wet signatures. Are there any other tools that you would recommend someone consider when you're looking to automate processes? And I think specifically what would be interesting to hear is, why do you choose to use certain ones? Like what's the benefit? I've heard a little bit of DocuSign versus Build, but are there other ones where this is my tool for this type of thing?
I'll throw in a couple of other names. So we also have OnBase implemented in the institution for, and we haven't had it for a long period of time, but we've had it for a couple of years now, for document-centric elements. And OnBase has a workflow tool. It has a forms component. We also have, so we're a Sharewell school for ITSM. We're also pretty new into that environment. A lot of the other folks on the call probably have ServiceNow or something similar. So those typically also have a workflow and a forms component as well. I think from a choice standpoint, it is a matter of trying to figure out what the core need is and where the integration touch points might be that maybe dictate or influence the choice of tool. And also, you know, how urgent is this, and is this something that we need to do with something that's more lightweight? So for us in general, if lightweight is a driver and there's some time constraints, we're gonna lean towards the build side. And depending on where some of the integration points might be, if it's, say, document archive heavy, we may lean towards the OnBase side. If it's, you know, if it's something that does require some external interfaces from a legal point of view, we have Adobe eSign, we have DocuSign in one of our construction management pieces. So there's a bunch of these that exist, and if you go to any other campus or system, I think you'll find the same. There's going to be a bunch of those that are available based on what's been acquired over time, and then you look and see which hammer in your tool case fits the best. You know, for those of us with only one hammer, then that's the hammer you're going to use. But most of us have multiple that are available to us, and we'll choose based on the skills of the individuals that happen to be sitting around the table, and the breadth of who else you can reach out to help solve problems.
I'd like to sort of piggyback on what you say, Garrett. I also think that one of the considerations is whether it's an absolutely necessary permanent change, or whether it's an interim step that leads you to the longer term workflow or the hammer, so to speak. And the best example I have is actually from Quali research and transitioning and proposal submission. So transitioning from a paper form and a wet signature that must be walked around campus versus using quality research and proposal development and the automated routing for approval. As an interim step, when we were preparing both of those implementations at my previous university and at Southern, as an interim step, we went to an email routing. And that interim step helped people get used to the fact that the information was coming electronically and they just needed to do an electronic reply, look things over, electronically reply, and be done. So when the transition came and the implementation for quality research happened, the automated email notifying them that they had something to go see, the very simple, follow the link, there you are, review it and approve it, that transition didn't seem like it was so dramatic. One of the really nice things about Quality Build at this stage is I don't have to build a form that's going to be permanently in use. I can build something that helps me move that transition from what is currently now a strictly paper wet signature process into a minimal threshold of electronic routing and approvals, which can then transition seamlessly into the permanent document storage on base or a banner workflow or whatever it might be. Part of the challenge is getting the institution and organization to think, oh, well, I'm here at point A and where I want to be is actually at point C or D, and I'm not willing to take an interim step that will help me get there while the systems and supports and the larger build out is happening on that really sophisticated or better software. We use the Banner financial system. And so there is some limited workflow available there. So the finance people are usually saying, no, we're going to take 4 years and implement the workflow in Banner. I'm like, I got 4 years of standing around waiting for some emergency and people to change and dragging that project out. Or we could take this interim step and use this highly flexible tool to begin to retrain our campus so that the transition from, oh, I used to fill out a paper form and walk it around. What do you mean I don't have to do that anymore? No, you follow this link, and when IT is ready and Banner Financial is ready, that link will simply lead you to a different location. So you begin to retrain the campus on a very subtle and easy way without having everyone required to come to a training course, which is like pulling teeth. I mean, who wants to come and sit in training, right? Electronic or in person. But so that ability to get past that idea that you have to go from what I have now to what I want in the future without being willing to take an interim step that may serve you temporarily for a few years, but helps to prepare your campus and your functional users so the transition doesn't really seem as big as they think.
So at San Diego, we have mixed bag of tools for different things, as Garrett hinted at. A lot of the larger packages have embedded workflows already in them, and so our general approach is to utilize the domain-specific workflow, if at all possible. So, for instance, we have ServiceNow for IT ticketing and case management and things. There's no need for us to try to do any kind of workflow for that type of function outside of that tool. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. However, there are other, both, you could call them local departmental. Some of them are more lightweight than others. Some of them are actually quite complex, especially out in a lot of the academic units on the campus. And so our plan, especially for Build, is to distribute this out into a large part of the campus and then have a community of practice built up so that they can leverage each other to help build some of these workflows within that tool. But for instance, if we're doing invoice routing and approval, there's no reason why we wouldn't just keep that in our financial system. It can do it. And so it's really, we try to put it into the right container when we can. And then if we don't have a fit, that's when we would fall on a general purpose workflow tool like Build, right, in that case. So that's sort of our general approach.
Let me add just real quickly to that. Like San Diego and frankly like everybody else in our industry, that our IT population is highly distributed. So central IT, that's my organization, is actually only 40% of the IT specialist headcount across the system. So one of the other things we're trying to do is, I go back to the Microsoft Access world. You know, if you roll back the clock 20 years ago, these things popped up all over the place because they could. And the thing we're trying to do, one of the things we're trying to do with Build is to put this tool out there because it's responsive, because it's pretty agile and can respond quickly, to put it out there so that we can actually start to create pockets, but using a more common tool set that we can actually have visibility in across the system, to give us an opportunity to have those things go ahead and stand up, but to do it in a way such that it's very much consistent across the different campuses and across the different programs, as opposed to somebody hiring their cousin who knows how to program in PHP and stand up an application. And oh, by the way, when the cousin drops out the door, nobody knows what's going on with this piece of software that, by the way, all of a sudden created this mission critical thing for this one particular program. And then now we're stuck with it and trying to figure out how to reverse engineer it. So this gives us an opportunity also to push the tool out more broadly into the different programs that allow them to do what they need to do in a timely manner without central IT getting in the way, but gives us the ability to have some more commonality across the system.
Great, thank you, everyone. I thought Garrett and Brian, your point, what I perceived it as is distributing, whether you want to say distributing power, distributing control or support, I think is really important. So having a tool set that supports that is critical. And Amy, I love your point about small steps. I used to do implementation and training, and one of the biggest training techniques we used to use, we called it baby steps, where you take a small part of a process, you implement it, you get someone comfortable with it, and then you move on to a larger one. So I think that's a really critical piece when you're thinking about how do I automate one of my processes. Well, I find one that someone's comfortable with doing a slight change for, and then I move forward and do something bigger next. I think one question I'd have, again, thinking about the future, is as we're looking forward to the next few months, what do you think some of the biggest challenges you'll see? So we talked about transitioning fully remote and or hybrid work. We talked about figuring out processes to automate. Are there any other challenges, either technology challenges that you're anticipating might happen in the next few months? Or are all those behind us? And if you do have any challenges that you're anticipating, how do you believe that you might be able to plan to handle some of these challenges?
So one of the biggest challenges for higher ed is that everybody across the country made this pivot in a very short period of time. So there's a bunch of duct tape out there. There's a bunch of things that were done because they had to get done in a week, or they had to get done in a couple of weeks. And while I think in general everybody responded very well across the board, we also recognize that what we're doing now is not truly the best way to do it for our faculty, students, and staff. And so we're delivering our programs. We're going to graduate students. They're going to finish their semesters. The courses will finish, but I think all of us agree that the way that we did it was effective because it was in crisis mode, but that's not the way that we want to do it forever. So I think this summer, what will happen is we will actually, not just on the IT side, but through the faculty programs as well, take a look at what we deployed and understand how we can make it better, and spend the next couple of months creating something that's more consistent with the vision of higher ed as we want to deliver it as a university package, as a university program. So we'll take a look, and again, not just at the IT side, but we'll take a look at the systems that we've delivered and the mechanisms that we've employed to get through the semester, and figure out a better way to do it for the fall and the spring and the next year and the next year. So part of that is also, like Amy said, we don't have 4 years, we don't have 5 years, we don't have 10 years to go develop something and deploy it in the fall. It's not going to happen. We have more than a week, but we don't have a number of years to do this. So an agile tool is super important to us to be able to improve our outcomes, improve our processes, so that we're better in the summer than we were in the spring, we're better in the fall than we were in the summer, and continue that on a going forward basis. I think that's very critical for us to pay attention to.
Yeah, I second what Garrett was saying, but I know, like, for us, I think a large part of this is going to be on the instruction side of the house. So one thing that we had to do, and I'm sure others had to do something similar, is we have over, I think we've got close to 100 different computer labs, one to 200 computer labs on campus, and so we had to quickly sort of change and move a lot of that to virtual lab capability. So we're actually using a combination of 3 different tools to deliver this at the moment. It was done quickly. It was done as cost effectively as we could, but it is quite expensive, and that's going to have to get looked at. And there are other specific computer labs that have instrumentation and other equipment attached that we still have not figured out how those could be done in a virtual environment. And then we have issues because Macs do not virtualize, and so we have issues trying to be able to do Mac delivery, which currently we're having students remote into actual lab gear that on the Macintosh side, just so they could use them. So that's one of the bigger challenges. One of the things that we heard, which others probably did too, a lot of the instructors who previously were either reluctant or just completely resistant to do any kind of online instruction, many of them have said, oh, well, I mean, that was hard, but that wasn't as hard as I thought. And I actually see some additional benefits in doing this, at least in certain circumstances. So I think the combination of the remote in-person is going to be even a more interesting question on the instruction side as to what that does to a lot of universities that were mostly in person. So I know for us, at least the current information we have is the large lecture courses in the fall are going to continue to be remote. They're going to, I think, in terms of now, allow some of the smaller classes to happen in person come fall, at least currently. But so that is going to be an interesting challenge, is to how do we now optimize the cost of this? I started with the computer labs, but optimize the use of these software tools and technologies to be able to deliver instruction remote, ongoing. How do we provide computer lab capability to students while they're in a hybrid model? And how do we recover from the financial hit that we're all going through right now? It's when you get into crisis mode, the checkbook opens up temporarily and you can kind of spend what you need to, but that checkbook closes down at some point. And so those, I think, are going to be the larger challenge, far greater than what IT has to go through.
So again, I'll transition based on Brian's last word. He talks about that checkbook opening up. As a functional administrator on the sponsored program side, every single one of those projects, whether they are research-based or community service-based or program-based, usually begins with some kind of a face-to-face interaction and supports, through the external funding, some kind of face-to-face interaction, either because a researcher is talking to research subjects, or a researcher is working with animal subjects, or A program director is working within the local community, providing a service or a program to people within the community. We don't often, in the sponsored research or the sponsored programs portfolio, we're not completely supporting instruction. You know, that's the main business of the university, but the sponsored programs portfolio, as it relates to research and these sponsored projects, the questions are actually going to be much more difficult to deal with. Best example, we have a CDC grant that is entirely community-based on getting people that we employ out into the community groups. Well, if we're not allowed to meet in groups larger than 10, we all have to wear face masks if we're going to meet. We have to deal with even more stringent state and local guidelines related to public health. Then the primary reason for that activity to be funded cannot occur. So while the basic operations around the IT to support and how the academic world and the classes transition, how our universities address this issue of the sponsored programs and the projects that they support and how they can continue to do that, we actually end up facing a question of losing all of that financial support. If we cannot fulfill the requirements of the contract or the grant or the proposal that we submitted, we're getting money to sit still. And so it's, from a production and a performance perspective, it's going to be an even larger challenge. One of the things we'll be discussing at my institution in the next 2 weeks is, what do we do with all the summer research experiences? Now, this may have been one student or one intern, a student researcher or a student intern being placed in a lab or a company, but all of those experiences are based on an in-person process. You cannot do a laboratory experiment remotely. That just does that. It just, you can't do it. So how do we provide that research experience for the student, fulfilling the performance requirements of our sponsor, as well as continuing to enhance the student's academic education? I don't have an answer for that. I wish I did. The brain starts to go crazy. But the real issue will be, how do we transition so that we can continue to receive that external funding? Many of those projects offset operational costs, but they provide an enriched and enhanced environment for our students. That's I don't know. I think it's in jeopardy.
Thank you all for sharing some of those challenges and for being here on today's webinar. We really appreciate your perspective, your experience, and sharing what you've all been doing to get through this. So thank you, everyone. We're at our time. I want to wrap up and make sure I'm respectful of everyone's time. Thank you all for attending today's discussion. Just as some quick housekeeping notes, you will receive an email following today's discussion with a short 30-second survey. We'd love your feedback on how you felt it went and how we can go ahead and improve content like this in the future for you. And as a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and will be sent to you in the next 48 hours. We hope to see you on our next webinar on May 28th about the changing role and priorities of higher education leaders post-COVID. Thank you all again for attending, and have a good rest of your afternoon. Thanks.